Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Avi, and I help run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion on Ben Rhodes' new book, After the Fall, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Whiten. We want to thank all of you for your support. With our loyal community of book lovers and authors such as Ben and Julia, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we're thrilled to have with us Ben Rhodes for the launch of his new book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made. Ben Rhodes is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The World as It Is, co-host of Pod Save the World, a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, and an advisor to former President Barack Obama. Joining Ben in conversation tonight is Julia Ioffe. Julia Ioffe is the founding partner and Washington correspondent for Puck. She has written about foreign policy and national security for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, GQ Magazine, Foreign Policy, Washington Post, and The New Republic. She is currently working on a book about Russia. So without further ado, please welcome Ben and Julia to the stage.
Ben, thank you so much for writing this book. As I told you in the green room, I think you have a future in writing. You're really good at it. Wow. So what really struck me about this book is, you come out of 8 years in the White House. You're in some of the most sensitive, consequential foreign policy meetings of our generation. And you seem still so puzzled by the world. And I'm wondering, what was it that clicked for you that, you said at one point you talked about, a reminder that history never ends. At what point did you realize that this trope created by Francis Fukuyama in the 90s that, this was the end of history now that the Soviet Union had collapsed? At what point did you realize that history had not in fact ended with the 90s and that the losers of the Cold War were trying actively to rewrite the rules and the outcome?
Well, thanks, Julia, for doing this. As someone who's admired your work for a long time, and as you say, occasionally answered your emails in the White House, you were dogged. For me, and I write about this in the book, I had to acknowledge that as an American who kind of came of age and became politically conscious around the end of the Cold War, I think I had it hardwired into me, a belief that history is moving in one direction, things are getting better, that freedom and democracy had won this epical struggle against autocracy and communism, and that there were obviously going to be bumps in the road and challenges along the way, but that the arc was moving inevitably in one direction. And I began to question that assumption in the Obama years. I'd say, Julia, and this is something you and I talked about at the time, the second term, when you had Putin really flexing and annexing Crimea and invading Ukraine, at the same time that the kind of radicalization that had taken hold of the Republican Party in the United States was kind of leading some Republicans to start to praise Vladimir Putin and kind of expropriate the same brand of nationalism that he represented. And you started to see, Brexit was building in the UK. You started to see leaders like Erdogan become more autocratic. I could sense a kind of building darkness around us in the Obama years. And then when I was spit out at the end of those 8 years in the White House, to the incredibly disorienting experience of Donald Trump winning. I think losing some kind of power is always a disorienting experience, but when you're replaced by your opposite who sets about dismantling everything you've worked on, you really do question assumptions. And the whole book for me is an effort to reckon with that and to kind of look around the world in order to understand not just what's happening globally, but in order to see more clearly what was happening in America and to see that this really is a question of the unresolved ghosts of history, the return of a blood and soil nationalism to our politics, and Putin definitely embodies that in many ways, and the growth of an alternative model from China that, taps into some of the fears of totalitarianism in the 20th century. These issues are very present, and the three countries I looked at, Hungary, Russia, and China, are all on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the other side of the Berlin Wall. And so they were interesting test cases as what did these 30 years lead to? And what can we learn about America? Because we, more than any country, have shaped the world over the last 30 years.
So, in reading your book, it came to seem that you had agreed or come to agree at some point with this idea that, in fact, maybe America was not exceptional, that maybe despite its institutions and all we think about, how unique our system of government is and the Constitution and the like, that in fact, we're just another country full of people just like anywhere else on earth, and like you said, caught like a piece of driftwood in the tides of history. Am I reading you correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, what's exceptional about America, and I do think there's something exceptional about America, it's the story we tell about ourselves, and it's the aspiration of a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy where people can work things out. We were supposed to be the country that had, because of our founding documents and because of lots of movements over the years, we were supposed to have solved this question of whether people who come from all over the world can live together and make it work. But what I had to reckon with was two things. I mean, the light bulb went off for me, Julia, to write this book with this concept of going around the world and talking to different people, from Hong Kong protesters to Russians like Alexei Navalny, to Hungarian democratic activists. The light bulb went off when I talked to a Hungarian, and I said, look, how did you guys go from being a democracy to a single party autocracy in a decade? And the guy said, well, that's simple. There was a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis that got Viktor Orban elected prime minister. He redrew the parliamentary districts. He packed the courts with right-wing judges. He changed the voting laws to make it easier for his supporters to vote. He enriched some cronies through corruption who then bought up the media and turned it into essentially a right-wing propaganda machinery that supports Orban. And he wrapped it all up in a nationalist bow, us versus them, the real Hungarians versus the immigrants, the liberal elites, George Soros. And, I'm listening to this guy and thinking like, well, this sounds pretty familiar. And the same thing, as we've all learned, the same thing can happen here that happens everywhere. We can have the corrupt autocrat with the son-in-law down the hall. We can have an insurrection on our parliament, and so I think that, just asserting American exceptionalism, as is so often the case in our politics, kind of elides the fact that we're not immune to these things. And just because we have a great story, and when we're living up to that story, we can do extraordinary things as a nation, I still believe that, doesn't mean that we can also give in to the darker impulses of global politics.
Right. In your book, you talk about certain pivotal events that have led us to this moment globally and to this moment domestically. You talk about 1991, 89, 91, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. You talk about 9/11 and what you call the foolish invasion of Iraq. You talk about it as an imperialist move. You talk about the 2008 financial crash. And then a lot of time passes, right? And I'm wondering, and you were in power and you were close to the man who wielded a tremendous amount of it on the global stage. What did you guys do wrong in those intervening 8 years? And in what way did the Obama administration contribute to this moment?
Well, I think I do have this chapter, The Ocean Liner, in which I reckon with this, and I'll come back to that in a second, because I do think, I sought to spotlight the Obama years as well as part of this 30-year period. And the way I think about this, I kind of identify three areas where the United States kind of unwittingly contributed to the trends we see around the world. And the quick version of them essentially is, one, our view of capitalism that was kind of unleashed and unregulated after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the excesses of that led to the financial crisis and the financial collapse. And what I found in looking back at that event is the extent to which that collapsed global confidence in American-led globalization. The idea that we could be trusted, the idea that the system was going to lift all boats. Suddenly people are seeing the financial crisis hit people a lot harder even in other countries in the United States. And that opened the door to nationalist appeals from people like Orban, who could at least say, in this very disconcerting world where you feel like you're getting screwed, I'm going to offer you the oldest identity in the book, your traditional identity. The second area is security, the national security obsession post 9/11, where the United States, which had kind of struggled to find a national purpose to replace the Cold War, after 9/11, Bush kind of made our national purpose fighting terrorism. And it was kind of this hyper-securitized approach that not only led to the overreach of the Iraq War, but it also kind of was expropriated by people like Putin, who used a similar framework to justify their own power grabs. It also contributed to an us versus them politics in this country, where what was once a war against terrorism, the enemy could be repurposed to a black president or to immigrants at our southern border. And then the last is technology, where we thought these tools, particularly of social media, were going to connect people, empower people, and they became kind of the perfect tools of disinformation and surveillance. The Obama years, I describe how Obama would describe the United States as an ocean liner, and it takes time to point the ocean liner in a new direction. And what I had to wrestle with is, I think we did a lot in those 8 years, on each of those issues to try to redress inequality in the United States by offering health care to more people, to try to wind down those 9/11 wars and shift to diplomacy and working on issues like climate change. But we did not change the fundamental structure of that ocean liner. We did not address some of the fundamental inequities in the global economy after the financial crisis. We did not dismantle the architecture of the post 9/11 security state, and we did not regulate social media in a manner that might have curbed some of this disinformation. Some of that is completely on us for the lack of action. Some of that is, as you see the Biden people having internalized, we thought we'd have more than 2 years to make structural change, and we only had control of Congress for 2 years, and we really couldn't do much more to get at the structure of things after we lost control of Congress. And some of that was the constraint of a racial backlash to the first black president that created a lot of kind of guardrails around the freedom of action that the Obama administration had. That doesn't absolve us. What I wanted to do is learn in the most honest way the lessons from that period of time, so that we can apply them going forward. And the other thing I'd say about this, Julia, is that one thing I also learned is that we kind of put too much stock in what any one person could do. The challenges we face require a president being as bold as possible. It requires members of Congress doing that. It requires political participation at the local level. It requires movements like what Stacey Abrams is doing to get people more involved in politics. It's kind of a whole of society effort necessary to preserve our democracy.
Right, but in terms of foreign policy, that's just not the case. The president has a ton of latitude. You guys had the maximum amount of time. You had 2 full terms, starting with a massive mandate to structurally change America's approach to foreign policy. Barack Obama was elected to be not George W. Bush, who had started 2 wars, who started wiretapping Americans, who started these endless drone wars. Obama promised to close Guantanamo, but he didn't. He expanded the drone warfare. He didn't. There was a lot of things he did not do, and you were right at his side. Where did you guys go wrong in your foreign policy? You had a tremendous amount of power and leverage. You were, the captain of the ship, of the biggest, most powerful ship on the planet, and you had the full time. What do you think you should have done differently?
Well, I think that when I look back on it, Julia, in the second term, first thing I'm going to say actually is some of that is on us, but some of that is, again, the structure of things. We would have closed Guantanamo in a heartbeat if we could have. Congress passed a law in the first year that we were in office preventing us from transferring any prisoners from Guantanamo to the United States. And we weren't going to get other countries to take every single one of those people. So what we could do is transfer every detainee that we could to other countries and get it down to about 40 people. And then we're still living with the insanity of this prison open in Guantanamo Bay. I make that point not to excuse us, but to illustrate that we have a lot of power, but you have to shift the discourse on issues. And actually, what gives me some hope is you see much more of an active progressive movement on national security and foreign policy issues today than a decade ago. In the same way that I think the discourse was shifted, in a more progressive direction on domestic policy, and that has led to a much more progressive Joe Biden than we would have seen in the Obama years, right? Now, in terms of what we did do, I think in the second term, I think we were slow. I think when we came in, we're dealing with the financial crisis. I was frustrated at the pace with which we were seeking to kind of unwind our wars. If you look at our first term cabinet, very conventional people. Bob Gates was the first
right, and that's
right?
a structure. That's a structure where you had full latitude. Not you, but the president had full latitude to change that, at least that structure, and he didn't. I think right,
and that's right. And then in the second term, we had a different team and a different approach. And what was interesting in looking back on this, as I have, is that things like the Iran deal, the Paris Climate Agreement, the opening with Cuba that I had negotiated, I think that is a fundamentally different American foreign policy. And you remember from covering that how hotly contested those things were. So I actually think that when I look back on it, I feel like in that first term, we lost time. Like when I look back, what do I regret? The Afghan surge, in retrospect, feels like it was something that extended the Afghanistan war beyond what was perhaps necessary. And I became increasingly frustrated. I think there's no secret, that I had, like a sense of impatience with how fast we were changing things. But I do think in that second term, we were putting forward a very different American foreign policy. And interestingly, that's when there was the most controversy over our foreign policy. It was much less political heat over what we were doing around the world in the first term, when we kind of weren't rocking this ocean liner boat. And then the second term, when we did, it was much more difficult. So, but I do think that's still a template for an America that moves past this. I describe in the book, for instance, the depth of the structural challenges posed by the 9/11 mindset, where a guy I knew, Mohammed Sultan, and I'm saying this to be kind of self-critical of U.S. foreign policy. He was an Egyptian American who I came to know because we'd helped get him out of prison in Egypt. He'd gone to Egypt during Tahrir Square. He'd been a part of the movement that ousted a dictator. Then when there was a coup in 2013, removing Mohamed Morsi, he was shot, imprisoned. They tortured him. In horrible ways. They let people die in his cell. They made him listen to his father being tortured as well. He went on a hunger strike. And then they put an ISIS recruiter in his cell because the Egyptian government that we subsidize with billions of dollars in assistance wants to radicalize the opposition. That's the justification for their suppression. That's the justification for all the money America gives to them. And Mohammed is in this insane position of debating an ISIS recruiter about the validity of nonviolent and the efficacy of nonviolent protest versus violent resistance. If that's where American foreign policy has gotten itself tied in knots, we need to fundamentally change that. And I felt that at the time and argued that at the time. I didn't win all those arguments. So I totally accept the premise that we need to do more. I will say, Obama was still, I think, even, if you look at Joe Biden this far, Obama was pushing pretty far in that second term. And then, of course, Trump comes in and just dismantles everything we tried to do with the Iran deal and the Paris Climate Agreement and the Cuba opening and the rest of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Cuba opening, I think, is kind of controversial because, you open, grand opening, grand closing. You could have, there could have been more done. I think your critics would say that there could have been more done to get some kind of guarantees of political liberalization and protection of human rights in Cuba in return for that opening, because this was just, it seemed like on a very, superficial, high level, again, grand opening, grand closing. I also wanted to ask you, there was a phrase, there was a part in your book that really, jumped out at me. And you were talking about how you were in Cuba, and it seems like you were hit by one of these directed energy weapons, right?
Yeah, well, and look,
you're thinking.
Yeah, I'll tell the story. I do want to say, Cuba made a lot more progress in terms of releasing political prisoners and, expanding access to the internet and opening up space for private sector just in the 2 years that we were engaging with Cuba. And, you know, that was informed by listening to actual Cubans and not just the Cuban government. And this infuses my book. We proclaim to know what's best for the Cuban people and put an embargo on them, and basically hermetically seal them from the rest of the world. And it makes us look terrible that we're harming these people, and it's done nothing to promote human rights. So I think
it doesn't really hurt the people at the top. They can still get whatever they want, right?
I interacted with those people. Those people had everything that they wanted, right? So I do think that this kind of premise that we have to negotiate the capitulation of our adversaries in order to change things, it gets us stuck. Now,
I didn't say capitulation of.
I know, but I think that's what informs the kind of Marco Rubio mindset on this. But on the story I tell, and I was trying to get at, the kind of disorient. I start the book in 2017, and I'm describing how I'm traveling and just having a sense of everything taking a dark turn. And I went down to Havana, and I met a friend of mine from the embassy who told me about these attacks that had taken place, or these mysterious health incidents where people had gotten ringing in the ears, they'd gotten incredibly sick, and they didn't know what it was. Now, he and I, just speculating there, saw a kind of Russian hand behind this. And I felt that not just because I am one of these kind of people who sees Putin's hand behind everything. When I did negotiate the opening with the Cubans on multiple occasions in multiple countries, I was tailed by Russians, very overtly, Julia. They were speaking Russian. They wanted me to know that they were there. And the Russians also don't shy away from harming Americans or people in third countries. This is something that they've done increasingly. And it didn't strike me as something that the Cubans would have done. I don't know exactly what happened to me. I do know that a couple of days after I learned of this, I woke up feeling about as sick as I can remember being. And I was like, well, is this food poisoning? And I had to take a tour of Santiago that day that some people wanted to give me there, the kind of second biggest city in Cuba. And let's just say, while I'm being shuttled around and shown all these sites, the Cuban Revolution, I was very ill throughout the day, very weakened. I have no idea. Maybe I had food poisoning, but I know I had a horrific headache, incredibly feeling of weakness that endured for a couple of days, very sick. So I don't know. But just the fact that you have to ask the question, right, kind of speaks to how unsettling the international environment is. And we've since learned that there are these kinds of attacks that have taken place not just in Cuba, but all over the world, including in Washington, D.C. And again, I don't know the information myself. I know that the Cubans can't do that. I know the Russians can. And I hope that they're getting to the bottom of it.
Yeah. Well, having reported on this and reported on, these attacks on American soil and in, third countries that are allies of the U.S., reading that really jumped out at me. But the other thing in that section that really jumped out at me, where I was trying to go, is, you're not feeling well. You come back to your hotel and you're lying on your bed and you're looking at the ceiling and you're thinking, and you write, how do we misled all these people, from the Cubans who wanted to move beyond the past, to the Europeans who saw America as a guarantor of democracy, to the Burmese who wanted democracy themselves, people who had trusted us only to be burned. And what I immediately thought of was Syria. And to me, it's just a massive blight on the record of Barack Obama's presidency, because it seems like we did just enough to prolong the war, but nothing to help the rebel side win it, or to, totally take our hands off the scale. It seems like we just prolonged the suffering and then created problems, which then created problems for the European Union, which many people say led to Brexit. And I'm wondering, do you regret that? Do you regret, the advice you gave, the decisions that your team made in that crisis? Do you feel like you burned the Syrian people who really thought you were going to step in for them.
Well, I don't write about that in this book. I write about that a lot in my my first book, and I do want to say that they're kind of two different things, because what I was saying about raising expectations in places like Cuba is that that was the feeling I had when people would ask me what, and I'll get to Syria, but people would ask me what were you most upset about with Trump undoing your legacy, and they would ask it as if like it was a scorecard that I was proud of having my Cuba accomplishment and now it's been somehow taken away. That's not what upset me. What upset me is I traveled to Cuba a lot, and people were so excited that things were finally opening up, things were finally changing. And then I had to feel like, they only opened things up because on some level, the people I was negotiating with trusted me. And then the rug gets pulled out from under them. And so to me, that part of what was so disorienting about the speed at which Trump kind of reversed things was that sense of like, we'd brought all these people along to do these things. To make these changes, and then they're left kind of holding the bag, and I am suddenly powerless to help them. Now, Syria is a different question. Look, the one thing I take issue with is the way you describe it is almost like we initiated the conflict. Look, Assad is the one responsible.
No, but you called, Obama called for,
yes, so,
I have to stop saying you, but Obama called, said Assad must go. He drew a red line. And he didn't back up either of those statements. And I think people, leaders around the world who don't have the same ideals that Barack Obama did and you and I do, saw that as a signal. And I think we're seeing the effects of that now, both in Belarus and in Russia, and certainly in Syria. You can do what you want. The U.S. will just, the other thing that popped in, that also stood out to me in your book is you're talking about Boris Nemtsov getting assassinated under the Kremlin walls. I mean, it was so incredibly shocking, right? It was so clear what happened. Like you said, that all the dots weren't connected, but you kind of knew what happened anyway. And you were talking about the statement you guys issued at the time and how, in retrospect, how impotent that statement feels. That you just said some angry words, and there was not much you could do to back them up. And in a place, Syria, which doesn't have nuclear weapons, which doesn't stretch across 11 time zones, which wasn't a former global superpower, you did have some leverage, and the administration seems to have kind of, I remember the administration saying like, well, it'll be okay, great, it'll be Russia's dumpster fire. Well, and there was a kind of sense of like, we're happy to hand this off to somebody else.
Okay. We're getting pretty far from the book, but what I'd say about this, Julia, is that when I look back on Syria, look, I argued I've had a very interesting evolution on this issue, because I argued in the Situation Room for military intervention in Syria. But I ultimately found myself persuaded by Obama's caution that essentially, once that war had started, the idea that the United States could militarily intervene and have a better result than we'd had in Iraq or Afghanistan, that we could somehow do this with cruise missiles. There's a counterfactual that's missing here, in the sense that I get the frustration that people feel that Assad kind of got away with it. But I also don't know that I can honestly say, looking back on that even if we'd taken out Assad, that you still wouldn't have mass human suffering and refugee flows in Syria. We had 150,000 troops in Iraq, and we couldn't stop sectarian fighting there. Our presence, in some ways, contributed to the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became ISIS, which kind of spilled over into Syria. And I do think, to kind of take issue with the kind of theory of everything, this, Julia, Putin wasn't just suddenly emboldened because of Syria. I think it obscures that there was a building set of forces in the world that were contributing to this rise of authoritarianism, nationalism, a kind of counter-revolutionary force from Putin that can be traced all the way back to the 90s. And Syria became a particularly ugly manifestation of a certain aspect of Russian foreign policy, which is just to burn everything down, to kind of create chaos and suffering as as an effort to disrupt the international order.
Well,
So
I
look,
would argue that they didn't just burn everything down. They bolstered Assad and helped him recapture Syria, in effect saying, you know, we draw the line here, and we're not going to let you topple any more dictators, and we're going to make sure that they all stay.
Yeah, but toppling, look, toppling dictators hasn't also worked as a policy either. I mean, we've toppled 3 of them in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And, so again, I think that part of what I really wanted to convey here is that when I reflect on this and I look at the world and I talk to people around the world, part of the American mindset that I think has gotten us into trouble is an idea that this is about, part of what happened that was bad for democracy in the world is that democracy globally became attached to regime change policies, attached to a war in Iraq, where it was a kind of post facto justification, and that it obscured that the most important thing that the United States can do on behalf of democracy around the world is set a good example, is to have a healthy democracy in our own country. And some of the failures of the United States domestically to have an approach to capitalism that doesn't lead to this kind of rampant inequality that creates grievance-based nationalism, that again would get our arms around American-made social media platforms that become tools of disinformation, that again interrogates whether or not this kind of hyper-securitized multi-trillion-dollar enterprise of the war on terror was ultimately a corrosive force for our own democracy and democracy around the world. That's kind of what I was wrestling with. And again, I truly, while, when I look at our Syria policy, precisely because I find it hard to believe that there was some military solution there, the thing that you can find the most fault with, I think, is the raising of expectations, the calling for Assad to go, knowing that we couldn't force that to happen. But I think that it would be wrong to draw a lesson, I'm not suggesting you are, that one more regime change effort in the Middle East would be any different than the other 3. Because,
oh no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, it was he must go, but somehow. I think that, given our history in the region, I think that kind of statement elevated expectations. I did want to say, though, what I found interesting about the Obama administration's foreign policy, which you were part of, was this kind of admission, right? And I remember being in a briefing with President Obama when Russia had invaded Ukraine in 2014, where he kind of acknowledged the limitations of American power. And he said, it's like if we invaded Mexico and we really, really wanted to be there, and we wanted it more than anybody else wanted us out of there, there's not all that much anybody else could do to stop us. And he was kind of acknowledging that, the limitations of U.S. foreign policy. And ability to affect change in other countries. But I wanted to get back to your book. I was, and I was thinking about your academic background, and maybe this is like a, college wars, but I was thinking back to your academic background. You studied English and political science. And as a history major, I was reading this book, and, your sense of kind of, and I don't know if this was a kind of narrative technique, this kind of sense of wonder and awe that history doesn't end, that, golden ages of peace and prosperity never go on forever, that history is never linear. It made me wonder, could some of these conclusions have been arrived at earlier, before you went into the West Wing, if you had been older and more experienced at the time? And not, this, brilliant wonderkind who's really good at writing speeches, but doesn't have as much experience meeting the kinds of people you met in the book who taught you a lot about how things work, or if, you had studied a bit more history.
I don't think so, Julia, in the sense that, I mean, look, my job when I went to the White House was to write speeches. And then when you talk about American foreign policy, it's not like the people that, had a lot of experience they tended to be the people who had most internalized the lesson that the United States could kind of do what we want, that these things were settled. I mean, that my experience of being in debates in the Situation Room actually is that it was the generation that had kind of become of age and been in government in the 90s that kind of had failed to see the excesses of American policy, and that time was kind of frozen. You can't get something like the Iraq War, for instance, without thinking that you can kind of do whatever you want in the world. And look, to take it back to something you just mentioned, Russia. This idea that we could essentially encourage what was a Russian policy, but there was American encouragement in the 90s to basically sell off the state industries, which created this class of billionaire oligarchs and kind of enraged Russians, and then expand NATO into the former Soviet Union, then extend NATO membership action plans to countries like Ukraine and Georgia that really hit it, deeper into what Russia saw as, its neighborhood. That those were the policies that, to some extent, and not entirely, I don't want to assign blame just to America on this, but that fueled the kind of grievance-based revanchism of Vladimir Putin. And I do think that, so it's not, I see what you're saying. I mean, but I don't think that the people that had a lot of experience, they actually had more internalized a kind of permanence to American hegemony that had expired by the time. I mean, I'll tell you, when I walked into the White House, Julia, the first thing I felt was, we don't control things in the same way that people think who work in my field. After the kind of twin body blows of the Iraq War and the financial crisis, we were in a new world already. And I remember reading, China's rising, and then going to a summit where China had far more votes in its pocket than the United States in 2009, and being like, they've already risen here, So I actually think that I'd actually turn inside out. I wish like I knew all the things I know now. You always wish that, but I also think that my youth at times was an asset, because a lot of the people who kind of learned their lesson of what American foreign policy is in the 90s kind of felt there was this permanent capacity to shape events around the world, and that's the kind of mindset that I think has actually gotten America in trouble in terms of overreach, and overreach that has fueled a backlash from the likes of China and Russia in the last decade or two.
So before we go to questions, and I just want to remind everyone, you can ask questions in the chat and I will get to them momentarily. But I wanted to give you a softer question now. I love the people in this book and the way that you kind of absorb their insights and you tell us about their life experiences and what they teach you about, our place in the world, our place in history as a piece of driftwood in the currents of history, which I thought was a beautiful phrase. Who was your favorite, I want to say character in the book because I'm working on the book too, but the people you met and interviewed, who had the biggest impact on you, who really, stuck with you, that you kept thinking about, who really changed how you thought about things the most? And can you tell us about them?
Yeah, I mean, they're. I'm actually gonna, just because I go to 3 different parts of the world. There's 3 different people in different ways. One is in Hungary. There's a woman named Katalin Shea who's very young. She was born around the time of the end of the Cold War, and so I liked learning her story because it was basically a generation that had no memory of the kind of fall of the Berlin Wall. Her memory, she was shaped by the emergence of Viktor Orban. And what she did is she and some of her friends were so frustrated by this that they started their own political party because they didn't see themselves in the opposition. And they founded it on anti-corruption. Orban was going to host the Olympic Games. Putin had just done that in Russia. skimmed billions of dollars off the top, enriched his cronies. And they started a petition drive and got hundreds of thousands of signatures for a referendum to vote down Hungary hosting the Olympics, and defeated Orban. He retreated on that idea. And then they went out and they campaigned and built a party, and she got elected. And they showed up in these rural areas where Orban was dominant, and they went door to door. And it was this kind of very youthful insistence that Viktor Orban's view of who is a real Hungarian does not apply to me. As a young Hungarian, I do not think being proud of my country is inconsistent with being proud of being a part of Europe, or being proud of a set of democratic values that are universal and not just a Hungarian version of that. In Russia, Alexei Navalny had an enormous impact on me. And I didn't talk to him. It wasn't the length of time, although I spent a good amount of time talking to him. He's such a powerful force. And what really stuck with me in talking to Navalny is so real. We were on FaceTime, I remember, and he's like wearing a white undershirt. And we're talking about, what stuck with me is, we're talking about the risks. And he talked to me about being poisoned. And he talked about his motivations. He said, whenever I feel like I have no motivation.
Did you talk before or after the poisoning, the Novichok poisoning?
I talked, what was so eerie is I talked to him before the recent poisoning, but he'd been poisoned in the past. So we're talking about that. And I said, why do you keep going? And he said, it's because of the lying. If I needed motivation, I would just go to a Russian court, because all I'd hear is lies. And that anger motivated him. But then he also said, I don't want to just be a dissident. I don't want to just be like one of the Soviet era dissidents who's all by themselves and has to be exiled. I'm building an organization. I think I can beat this guy. I know his vulnerability. His vulnerability is his corruption. And he said also, the only reason I can do this, he's like, sure, I'm afraid. When the cell door clings shut behind me, I know they can do anything to me. But I know that my wife supports me, my family supports me. It was such a human way of casting it. And so then when I was texting with him after he was poisoned, and he was making jokes, no questioning of what he was doing. Obviously, he was going to return to Russia. And what stuck with me is he's returning to Russia because of what he told me. I don't want to just be a dissident in another country. I want to be there. That's so powerful. And I think about that sometimes when I see in this country, democracy slipping away because we can't get rid of filibuster. And this guy is getting poisoned and then returning to a country knowing he's going to be thrown in prison. And then the last piece is the Hong Kong protesters. And, what was so interesting to me about that is that I talked to some frontline protesters there, but then I found just some young people who were sympathetic to the protest movement, but they weren't that politically active. And what was so amazing to me about them is what they said is it's about democracy, but it's also about our identity. That they sensed this encroaching future, this kind of blend of capitalism and technology and totalitarianism was creeping into their lives. Suddenly people were told, don't post certain things on Facebook if you want to get a good job in Hong Kong. Don't do certain things. Don't even send emails that betray your political views in Hong Kong, not even in mainland China. And that assault on their identity is what propelled this massive movement that was, yes, for democracy, but also just for, one of them said to me, we just want to be left alone. And the reason they stuck with me is that there's not to be dark here, Julia, but I know you occasionally indulge in that. That's kind of where a lot of this is headed, right? I mean, if you take technology and its capacity to have total surveillance, and if you think I'm being alarmist, just look at John Cena, the actor, taping an apology in Mandarin for referring to Taiwan as a country. We are self-censoring in America right now because of our concerns about getting into the Chinese market. I tell the story of, talking to Daryl Morey, the GM of the Rockets, who just tweeted support the people of Hong Kong, and, became a multi-billion-dollar problem for the NBA. Those Hong Kong people stick in my head, both because of what's happened to their movement, but also because I see their movement as a warning. If you guys don't get ahead of this, if you don't get your arms around it, it's going to start, moving like an ink blot across the map of the world. This kind of particular blend of technology, capitalism, and authoritarianism. And that to me is at the core of what this book is about. Like, we're going in the wrong direction. we've given ourselves an opportunity in this country in the last election to do something about it. But we shouldn't have any illusions that we're going to get too many opportunities here.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the ink blot's done moved. And, I agree with you. And having, covered all these people, like especially in Navalny, the dissidents in Russia, it strikes me like we don't have those people except for maybe in the African American community. We'll always opt for the money. We'll apologize in Mandarin. We'll shake off a liability that gets in the way of our profits, and throw the Hong Kong protesters under the bus, because that seems to be where our priorities are, and we're kind of getting soft on those things, and it makes me sad. All right, so let's go to questions. So Kelsey asks, hi Ben, I was wondering if there's one thing readers should take away from this book, although there are many. What should it be? What is the message you want to leave us with?
The message I want to leave people with is, yes, there is this kind of global trend that we have to be aware of. And Julia, I think one of the hopeful things is actually there's much more awareness of this than there was like a decade ago. The challenges posed by inequality, by technology, by American national security policy. There's one trend, but the people everywhere sense it, and people everywhere are starting to push back on it. And the one thing I want people to take away is there's like more of us than them. Like around the world, I truly believe that people don't want to live in the kind of dystopia that I just described, and that if we can learn from one another, then we have more than a fighting chance here. And America is central to that. And while some of the criticisms I make may sound like someone who, is very skeptical of America's capacity to shape events in the world for the better, I'm not skeptical about the need to keep trying, because if we absent ourselves from that, then we are just leaving the field to the Xi Jinpings and the Vladimir Putins of the world. And that the most important thing we need to do, and this is why I subtitled it Being American in the World We Made, is we need to settle what our national identity is here. We need to center everything we do in the world in the protection and defense of a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy made up of people from everywhere. And if we can restore that foundation, then I think that's the most important thing we can do to give hope to people around the world who want something similar where they live. And that this is a generational struggle, and in the same way that history wasn't settled in 1990, history's not settled now. What the choices that people make matter. And the choices that everybody makes matters, and so that's my main message. We face a global challenge. It's urgent, but there are people out there everywhere who are aware of this urgency, and we can't afford to fail.
Yeah, I just want to, I want to agree with you and piggyback on that. I think if, the failure of Iraq and, the Arab Spring and the protests in Iran and the protests in Russia and Hong Kong showed us is that, not only is history never settled and it never ends, as you said, it also, democracy is never settled, and it's never secure, and it's not natural, right? I think a lot of times corruption is natural, and authoritarianism is natural, to hand off control to somebody else and to worry just about, your bread and butter and the roof over your head. And that it's a constant process of vigilance and education and voting and being active in your democracy instead of just putting it on autopilot, because the autopilot isn't settled either.
And I think that, and I say this in the book, you can get depressed watching movements fail, like the Hong Kong movement. But the other reality of movements throughout history is they fail and fail and fail until they succeed. Right. And there's a sense right now, there's a lot, I've never seen such mass mobilization. When you look at Hong Kong, when you look at Belarus, when you look at places like Colombia and Chile and Latin America against inequality, when you look at climate strikes, when you look at BLM and how that went global. And, movements fail. They failed throughout the Cold War until the late 80s, and then suddenly they all succeeded. And so I do think people should should not be discouraged when they see movements run into roadblocks. That's what autocrats count on, apathy.
Yeah.
The people of Belarus are particularly inspiring right now because, they're just not quitting, and that has to be the mentality we all have.
Yeah. Although they are facing, just an insane crackdown that I don't know that we can really fathom. A good question here from Benjamin Weinberg. Ben, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on the world has led to a recent backlash to the wave of authoritarianism or autocratic friendly governments who have failed to govern effectively in protecting their populations during the pandemic, as we have seen with Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, or even the Trump administration's response in 2020? Many thanks.
I totally believe that, and maybe it's because I want to, but I think that in this country, for instance, we could argue whether Trump would have gotten reelected if not for COVID. At a minimum, I think we can agree that COVID exposed the lunacy and danger of having a president who's just kind of a projection of a certain set of grievances in the right wing of American society. And, Maria Stepanova, one of the Russians I talked to, who's this wonderful writer, poet, journalist, she made this point to me that what unsettled her so much in recent years was that nationalism tends to lead to war, real big wars. It already has in places like Eastern Ukraine, but she was making the broader point. If you have, you have nationalists in charge everywhere, well, and just the collection of people in the Trump years, when you had Trump and Modi and Xi and Putin, Erdogan, and on, Bibi Netanyahu, like you just start to think, well, all it takes is one fire to catch and this thing could burn. And she said maybe COVID is the thing that, as terrible as it is, kind of averts that in the sense that it was this global event, a cataclysmic event that wasn't a war, that did, I think, at least in this country, and you're starting to see this a little bit in India, and you're certainly seeing it in Brazil, where Bolsonaro, the autocrat there, has had a huge backlash to his handling of this. It may be that nationalism, at least in some places, doesn't have to follow the historical logic all the way to that kind of violent conflict, in part because COVID itself has exposed the true failure of this brand of nationalist governance.
Yeah, though I would say, and I'm sorry, there's just, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In Russia, they've have one of the highest per capita mortality rates from COVID, and they've just, hidden the numbers, pretended that it doesn't exist, and most people have gone along with it. Nobody wants to get vaccinated. They don't trust the Russian vaccine. I can't blame them, but they also don't believe they're going to get sick from it, and they don't. It hasn't really touched Putin's popularity rating. So I feel like it could be a mixed bag, but I hope you're right. What I really liked about your book, and this person didn't leave a name, but I like that they asked about this. But what I liked about your book is that you touched on Aung San Suu Kyi and how people saw her as the saint and they lionized her, and then they were shocked that she said nothing. When the Rohingya people were, being ethnically cleansed and pushed, and beaten and killed and pushed across the border to Bangladesh, and we're suddenly very disillusioned with her. But you were saying, like, she's a product of her time and her geography. And somebody here asked, what kind of future do you see for a country like Myanmar and leaders like Aung San Suu Kyi? Much of the world as it is centered around that country, and I know you have friends there.
Yeah. So, first of all, I start there, a trip I took there in 2017. And I think that the point, what's so interesting about Aung San Suu Kyi is if you're a small to medium-sized country, surrounded by very big countries, you tend to reflect the global trend in the sense that when Aung San Suu Kyi rocketed to international attention, it was the late 80s and early 90s. And the trend was democracy. And that was what she was espousing. And that's what won her the Nobel Peace Prize. And she did wage a kind of incredibly stubborn, and I say that with admiration, a struggle on behalf of democracy. by the time she is partially in power, and because the military never really totally let go of its grip in Myanmar, although we've learned just how much there's a difference between the military having total control and this kind of shared system that they work towards. You know, part of, she was dealing, she became more of a Buddhist nationalist, which was very much the trend. And if you look at even something like the Rohingya ethnic cleansing and even the pre-coup direction of events in Myanmar, here's a country that to their north is China, where there are 1 million Uyghurs being put in concentration camps, targeting of a Muslim minority, not unlike the Rohingya. Then to their other side, they have India, where you have an emerging Hindu nationalist trend, kind of mirroring the Buddhist nationalism that you saw in parts of Myanmar. And then you have Thailand, where there was a military coup that restored the military to government because they didn't like how the elections were going. And so we, as tragic it is, shouldn't necessarily be surprised that if that's what's happening, that's what's shaping the environment around someone like her, that she might succumb to that kind of strain of things. Now, in terms of right now, I have a lot of friends in Myanmar. They've had an incredibly difficult time of it. I know people who've had to kind of escape the authorities, escape across the border into Thailand. I know people who are in the government in exile there. But what's so interesting, Julia, is it's in miniature what we've been talking about, in the sense that the Burmese military government is the kind of worst manifestation of autocracy, just power for the sake of power, nihilism, brutalism. But there's also nobody before in Myanmar, and this is what people tell me who are there, has ever remembered there being, without even Aung San Suu Kyi, such a popular movement of resistance against that. And there's a resiliency. We don't care if it takes a year or 5 years or 10 years. We're not accepting the legitimacy of these guys. And so it's kind of in miniature what's happening around the world, where you have a much more unified and resilient civil disobedience movement taking place, and then a much more virulent and autocratic military. And that's the competition in the world today. And right now, the wrong people are winning. But I don't think we should ever give up on the idea that those people don't have legitimacy. That's not what the people of Myanmar want. And that no matter how long it takes, they clearly are committed to struggling for this. And again, it should make us, from our positions of privilege, realize that if what we're facing is like the Texas legislature trying to pass Jim Crow laws, like we have an obligation to do something about that.
Yeah, these people put their bodies in the streets in Myanmar and suffer dearly for it. We are basically out of time, but because I wasted some time coughing at the beginning, and because I'm going to use my power to upend the structure of this talk, I want to ask this question that came in and got a vote, and I think it's a good question from Ned Garvey, and this will be the last one. Ned asks, I don't know if you saw the Protasevich interview that was aired in Belarus today, but what kind of response is available against a regime that's so willing to trot out torture victims on TV and relatively immune to Western political pressure? Even as Western rhetoric gets stronger and stronger and sanctions increase, the regime's actions get worse and worse. And that'll be the last question.
I saw that, and I it was horrifying, and it had echoes of Stalin. Like they've hijacked a plane, detained an oppositionist. Clearly, that was coerced. I couldn't help but notice, he had on his hands at one point, you could see some kind of, what looked like extreme cuffs or something, in the same way that his face has looked brutalized. I think that, in terms of the policy tools available that haven't been fully pursued, yes, I think you reject the legitimacy of Lukashenko. You provide support to the opposition there. Yes, I think you sanction them, and there, there's more to be done sanctioned in Belarus. But beyond that, I think just kind of going at the heart of the vulnerability of these regimes, it's the corruption. And this is something that, I very much, learned. I mean, I knew this, but Navalny really puts a fine point on it. the exposure of corruption, I think is something that the United States could do more of. We know, if we put resources into it, we can basically do what Navalny does and, publicize the opulence of these guys, publicize who their networks are. And then also something that needs to be done more of is to really go after the illicit financial flows that allow them to evade the consequence of sanctions, which run through New York and London. They run through the international systems of finance. People like Lukashenko and Putin in their circles, are masters of money laundering. Actually, there was a fairly wonky executive order on this today that I've talked to the Biden people about for a long time, which is exactly this, that kind of, it's not just enough to sanction them. You have to then go after the dark money that they rely on. And so I think this kind of all the above approach where you're sanctioning, then you're trying to choke off the illicit fund and money laundering, then you're publicizing the corruption, just spotlighting it, putting it out there, going on offense against them, and then providing real support to the democratic opposition as Lithuania is doing and essentially hosting the Belarus opposition. That to me would make a difference. And again, if that wasn't effective, then Navalny wouldn't be in prison. If Putin wasn't worried about these videos that Navalny was putting out about the opulence with which he lived, with the nature of the corruption of his circle, Putin is showing some vulnerability in the way in which he's seeking to strangle that. It doesn't mean that he is going to be defeated by that alone, but it's a guy like Lukashenko. I think that we haven't tried everything, and again, I think this is also, it's a small point, but it's an important one. Part of the reason you might ask, well, why has there not been more focus on this money laundering? Because the entire enterprise of our effort to kind of combat certain kinds of financing in the world after 9/11 was about terrorism. And the US government has finite resources. And we've spent trillions of dollars and given a lot of assignments to a lot of people to focus just on this one problem of terrorism, which I don't think is as big a problem as autocracy. And so I think it's about time that we're shifting that bandwidth. People don't realize there's a limited number of people working in the US government. You can't do everything at once. And so part of it is also just shifting the emphasis in this direction. Just think of, the trillions of dollars spent, the thousands of hours of time spent by people, the amount of diplomacy focused on this one thing, terrorism, over the last 20 years. That's part of what needs to be right-sized going forward.
Yeah, fully agree with you there. All right, Ben, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you to everybody who tuned in and asked wonderful questions. And thank you to the Strand for hosting this. I wish we could do it in person because I used to live in New York and I love the Strand and would spend hours and hours there. And I know Ben did as well. Yeah. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all for this amazing event. Very insightful. To our audience member, if you would like to make a purchase of Ben's new book, Being After the Fall, you could do so with the green link at the bottom of your screen. And with that note, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Take care.